Hey there, time travelers. Welcome back to TravelWise. Today we're hopping into the DeLorean of nostalgia to explore what air travel was like in the totally tubular 1980s. If you grew up in the era of leg warmers, Walkmans, and big hair, or you're just curious about how people jetted around before Wi-Fi and TSA, buckle up. This is going to be a wild ride. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let's take off to the skies of the 80s. Picture this. It's 1985. Ghostbusters is dominating the box office. Madonna's Like a Virgin is blasting on your Sony Walkman. You're about to board a Pan Am flight to New York, or maybe even London. Air travel in the 80s was a whole different beast compared to today. It was glamorous, chaotic, and sometimes a little sketchy, but oh man, it was unforgettable. In this video, we're diving deep into every aspect of flying in the 80s, from the airports to the planes. The food, the fashion, and even the quirks that would make modern travelers' jaws drop. So, grab your neon fanny pack, and let's explore what made 80s air travel so iconic. And if you love retro vibes like this, hit that bell icon so you never miss a video. Ready? Let's board this flight. Let's start at the airport. If you've only flown in the 2020s, the 80s terminal would feel like stepping into a time warp. First off, there were no self-check-in kiosks or mobile boarding passes. Nope. You walked up to a counter, handed over a paper ticket, yes, an actual booklet with carbon copies, and a human being checked you in. Sometimes they'd write your seat number by hand. Computers were just starting to creep in, but many airlines still relied on typewriters and paper records. Security? Oh, it was a breeze compared to today. The 1980s were pre-9/11s, so there was no TSA, no taking off your shoes, and definitely no full-body scanners. You'd walk through a metal detector, maybe get a quick pat down, and you were good to go. Some travelers even recall bringing pocket knives or lighters through security without a second glance. But don't get too nostalgic. Lack of security also meant higher risks. And hijackings were a real concern in the 80s, which we'll touch on later. Now, let's talk about the vibe. Airports in the 80s were loud, smoky, and full of character. Smoking was allowed everywhere. Lobbies, gates, even on the planes. You'd see people puffing away at the gate while flipping through a Time magazine or listening to their Walkman. The terminals were decked out in bold colors, think orange, brown, and mustard yellow, and the furniture screamed retro. Departure boards? Those iconic flip boards that made that satisfying click-clack sound as they updated. No smartphone apps here, you had to watch that board like a hawk in the shops. Forget fancy duty-free boutiques. You had newsstands selling Reader's Digest, tacky souvenir shops, and maybe a greasy spoon diner serving burgers and milkshakes. If you were lucky, there was an arcade with Pac-Man or Space Invaders to kill time. Airports felt more like bus stations than the sleek hubs we have today. Oh, and delays. They were just as common, but you couldn't track your flight on an app. You just waited and waited, maybe played another round of Galaga. What's your favorite 80s airport memory? Drop it in the comments below. Did you ever play an arcade game at the gate or buy a cheesy souvenir? Let's hear it. Alright, you've made it through the terminal, and now it's time to board. In the 80s, boarding was less organized. No priority boarding for elite members or strict group numbers. It was more like a free-for-all, with passengers crowding the gate. But once you stepped onto that jet bridge, you knew you were in for something special. The planes themselves were engineering marvels of the time. You had giants like the Boeing 747, the DC-10, and the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar ruling the skies. These were massive, with upper decks and lounges on some long-haul flights. But the interiors, pure 80s flair. Think bold patterns, bright colors, and seats that were actually comfortable. Legroom was generous compared to today's sardine can economy class. Some planes even had piano bars or lounges where you could sip a cocktail mid-flight. Can you imagine that today? Now, let's talk carry-ons. There were no strict size limits, so people brought everything, Huge suitcases, boom boxes, even guitars. Overhead bins were smaller, so you'd see bags stuffed under seats or piled in the aisles. And overhead bins didn't always have doors, so you prayed your bag didn't fall out during turbulence. And the boarding process. You've still got a paper boarding pass, often handwritten or printed on a dot matrix printer. First class got the red carpet treatment, but even economy felt a bit more human. Flight attendants greeted you with big smiles and sometimes handed out newspapers or candy as you boarded. It was a different era, folks. Now we're cruising at 35,000 feet, and the 80s in-flight experience was something else. Let's start with the big one, smoking on planes. Yep, you heard that right. Most flights had smoking sections, usually in the back of the plane. You'd have non-smokers up front, smokers in the rear, and a cloud of smoke just everywhere. By the late 80s, some airlines started banning smoking, but it was still common early in the decade. Imagine trying to enjoy your meal with cigarette smoke wafting over. Speaking of meals, food in the 80s was a highlight, especially in economy. Airlines prided themselves on serving hot meals, even on short flights. You'd get a tray with a main course like Salisbury steak or chicken cordon bleu, side salad, a roll, and a dessert, usually a slice of cake or pie. First class? Well, it was next level. Think carved roasts, caviar, and real china, and drinks. Free booze was standard, even in coach. Could sip a gin and tonic or a cheap wine while flipping through the in-flight magazine. Entertainment was, well, let's say limited. No personal screens here. Most planes had a single drop-down screen or two. Showing a movie like Back to the Future or Top Gun, you'd plug in flimsy headphones, those weird tube ones, and hope the sound worked. If you were lucky, the flight attendant might hand out playing cards or a kid's activity pack. Otherwise, you brought a book, your Walkman, or just stared out the window. The flight attendants, then called stewardesses or stewards, were the rock stars of the skies. Their uniforms were pure 80s, bright colors, bold patterns, and sometimes even hats or scarves. They were trained to be glamorous, friendly, and efficient, serving meals and drinks with a smile. But they also dealt with a lot rowdy passengers, smoke-filled cabins, and the occasional turbulence scare. Have you ever flown in the 80s? What was your favorite in-flight meal or movie? Share your stories in the comments. I'm dying to hear them. The 80s were the tail end of the golden age of travel. Airlines like Pan Am, TWA, and Eastern marketed flying as glamorous and exciting. Ads showed well-dressed passengers sipping champagne, and international flights felt like a luxury adventure. But let's be real, it wasn't all glitz. The 80s also had a gritty side. Deregulation in the US in 1978 shook up the industry, leading to cheaper fares, but also crowded planes and struggling airlines. Some carriers, like Braniff and Eastern, went bankrupt, leaving passengers stranded in safety. Well, the 80s weren't exactly the safest time to fly. Hijackings were a real threat. There were over 300 worldwide in the decade. Security was lax, and incidents like the 1985 TWA Flight 847 hijacking made headlines. Planes were also less reliable than today. Mechanical issues were common, and crashes, while rare, were more frequent than now. Still, most passengers didn't think twice. They just boarded and hoped for the best. But let's focus on the fun stuff. The 80s had a sense of adventure. Flying was still special. Whether you were jetting to Paris or just hopping to Chicago, people dressed up suits, dresses, even shoulder pads galore. And the destinations. The 80s saw a boom in international travel, with Europe, the Caribbean, and even Asia becoming more accessible. It was the era of the jet-set lifestyle, and everyone wanted a piece of it. To bring this to life, I scoured for real stories from people who flew in the 80s, and wow, did they deliver. One user, RetroFlyer82, said, "I was 10, and my family flew TWA to Florida. The flight attendant gave me a plastic pilot's wings pin, and I felt like a king." Another user, 80 Sky Queen, shared, I flew Pan Am to London in '87. The food was amazing, but the guy next to me smoked the whole flight. His sweater smelled like an ashtray. My favorite story came from Jet Set Joe, who said I flew on a DC-10 in '83, and they had a piano lounge upstairs. I sipped a martini while some guy played Sweet Caroline. It was like a party at 30,000 feet. These stories show how '80s air travel was equal parts wild, weird, and wonderful. If you or your parents flew in the '80s, share your stories in the comments, please. Let's keep this nostalgia flying high. Alright, wise travelers, we've explored the smoky terminals, crowded boarding gates, and lavish in-flight meals of 1980s air travel. But what did it all mean? What's the lasting legacy of flying in the decade of big hair and bigger dreams? The '80s were a turning point, a moment when air travel went from an elite privilege to something your average family could afford. It was messy, exciting, and a little chaotic, but it shaped the way we fly today. So let's dive into the bigger picture, the economic shifts, cultural vibes, technological leaps, and the pop culture that made '80s air travel so unforgettable. Stick around for a fun quiz at the end to test your '80s travel smarts, and let's keep this nostalgic flight soaring. The 1980s were a pivotal decade for aviation, largely because of the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978 in the United States. This game changer broke up the monopoly of big airlines and opened the skies to competition. Suddenly, new carriers popped up, offering cheaper tickets to destinations that used to be out of reach for many. A family in Ohio could plan a vacation to Miami without breaking the bank, and young professionals could jet to New York for a weekend getaway. But deregulation wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. It led to fierce price wars, which meant some airlines cut corners to survive. Smaller carriers struggled, and big names like People Express couldn't keep up, folding by the end of the decade. This was the birth of the low-cost airline model, setting the stage for today's budget giants like Spirit or EasyJet. The trade-off? Less focus on luxury and more on packing planes to the brim. It was the first step toward the no-frills flying we know now, where you're lucky to get a free pretzel. Beyond economics, the '80s reshaped who was flying and why. Air travel became more diverse as middle-class families, students, and even backpackers took to the skies. International tourism exploded, with Americans flocking to places like Ireland, Greece, or the newly accessible Japan, drawn by a growing fascination with global cultures. The '80s were also when business travel became a status symbol. Picture a Wall Street yuppie in a pinstripe suit, clutching a leather briefcase, boarding a flight to close a deal in Chicago or London. Flying was a badge of success, and airlines leaned into that image, offering frequent flyer programs to keep those high rollers loyal. Programs like American Airlines Advantage, launched in 1981, were a big deal, rewarding repeat travelers with free flights or upgrades. It was a genius move. Suddenly, people were picking airlines based on miles, not just price or service. Those programs are still around today, but they started as an '80s innovation to keep seats filled in a competitive market. Technology was another area where the '80s laid groundwork for the future. The planes of the decade were engineering marvels, but they were also on the cusp of change. The Boeing 747 was still the star, its massive size and long-range capabilities making it the go-to for transatlantic flights. But newer, more efficient planes were emerging. The Boeing 767, introduced in 1982, was a game-changer for smaller international routes, while the Airbus A320, launched in 1988, brought advanced avionics that made flying smoother and cheaper. Cockpits were evolving too. Pilots were starting to use early computer systems, though they still relied on paper charts and manual calculations for navigation. Compared to today's digital displays and GPS, '80s cockpits were like a mix of high-tech and old-school, with rows of analog gauges and switches. These advancements made flying safer and more reliable, even if passengers didn't notice the changes behind the scenes. The '80s also saw improvements in air traffic control, with radar systems becoming more sophisticated, reducing the risk of mid-air collisions. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step toward the precision we take for granted now. The cultural impact of 80s air travel went beyond the airport. Flying was a symbol of ambition and freedom, woven into the decade's obsession with success and excess. Pop culture amplified this vibe. The 1980 comedy Airplane was a hilarious send-up of air travel, poking fun at everything from chatty seatmates to dramatic pilots. It became a cultural touchstone, quoted endlessly by fans. TV shows like Dallas or Dynasty often showed characters hopping on planes to seal business deals or escape to exotic locales, reinforcing the idea that flying was for the elite or those who wanted to feel elite. Music played a role too. Songs like Leaving on a Jet Plane by John Denver, though older, were still popular, evoking the romance of travel. Even airline ads were mini masterpieces, with catchy jingles and images of smiling passengers living the high life. British Airways' 1989 Face ad, with its surreal visuals and operatic soundtrack, captured the grandeur of flying in a way that still gives goosebumps. These ads didn't just sell tickets, they sold a lifestyle. Speaking of lifestyle, let's talk about the passengers themselves. The 80s saw a shift in how people approached flying. It wasn't just about getting somewhere, it was about the story you could tell. A transatlantic flight to Paris wasn't just a vacation. It was a chance to come back with tales of the Eiffel Tower or a fancy French dinner. People saved up for these trips, and airlines knew it, offering package deals that bundled flights with hotels or tours. The rise of travel agencies was huge in the 80s. Agencies like Thomas Cook or American Express Travel were go-to spots for booking dream vacations. Let's not forget the fashion. Passengers didn't show up in sweatpants or flip-flops. Men wore blazers or polo shirts, women rocked power suits or flowy dresses, and kids were dressed like mini adults. It was a time when flying felt like an event, and your outfit had to match the occasion. Imagine boarding a plane today in a three-piece suit. People would think you're a CEO or a time traveler. I dug online to find more stories from 80s travelers and their gold. One user, Globetrotter80, shared, "I flew United to Tokyo in '88 for my first international trip. The flight was 14 hours, but they gave us hot towels and a menu with 3 choices. Even in coach, I felt so fancy." Another user, Skywalker81, said, "I was a teenager on a Northwest flight to Minneapolis in '86. The guy next to me was a businessman who spent the whole flight typing on a massive laptop. It was the size of a suitcase. He let me try it, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever." Then there's Flyin' High 85, who wrote, "I took a red-eye on Continental in '87, and the flight attendant slipped me an extra dessert because I was traveling alone." That kind of kindness doesn't happen anymore. These stories paint a picture of an era when flying felt personal, like the crew and passengers were all in it together, sharing an adventure at 35,000 feet. The 80s also set the stage for environmental debates that we're still grappling with. Jet fuel consumption was a growing concern, especially as more planes took to the skies. Environmentalists started raising alarms about carbon emissions, though it wasn't a mainstream issue yet. Airlines were more focused on efficiency than eco-friendliness, designing planes to burn less fuel to cut costs, not to save the planet. Still, the seeds of today's sustainability push were planted in the 80s. As researchers began studying aviation's impact on the atmosphere, it's wild to think that even back then, people were starting to question how all this jet setting might affect the world. Another legacy of the 80s was the global connectivity it fostered. As airlines expanded routes, the world felt smaller. A flight from New York to London, once a luxury, became a standard business trip. Cities like Miami became hubs for Latin American travel, while Los Angeles grew as a gateway to Asia. This connectivity wasn't just about tourism, it fueled globalization. Business deals, cultural exchanges, and even fashion trends crossed borders faster because of air travel. The 80s were when the world started to feel truly linked, and airlines were the threads weaving it together. That sense of a shrinking planet is something we take for granted now, but it was revolutionary at the time. So, would I want to fly in the 80s? You bet, for the sense of occasion, the chance to dress up, and the feeling that every flight was a little adventure. But I would probably draw the line at the long delays and the lack of real-time updates. Give me a flight tracking app any day. What about you? Would you trade today's convenience for the 80s experience? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Here's a challenge. If you could revive one 80s travel trend, maybe dressing up for flights or those epic travel agency vacation deals, what would it be? Share it below to keep the nostalgia alive. Before we land, let's test your 80s travel knowledge with a quiz. First, what was the name of the jumbo jet that symbolized 80s air travel? Second, which U.S. airline launched the first frequent flyer program in 1981? Third, true or false? International tourism to Europe surged in the 80s. Fourth, which 1980 comedy movie parodied air travel with lines like "Don't Call Me Shirley"? And fifth, what was the name of the British Airways ad campaign from 1989 that used operatic music? Drop your answers in the comments. That's a wrap on our journey through 80s air travel. If you loved this nostalgic trip, give this video a like, subscribe, and hit that bell for more retro goodness. Until next time, safe travels.